Hello, all of my history-loving friends. Welcome to the world of Madame Morbid, where the only rule is the people profiled here must be dead. Basically, this is a history channel. If you like what you see, please like, please subscribe to my channel, turn on notifications. I usually upload about once a week. Today, we're going to be talking about vigilantes. Some of you might have heard of the Baldknobbers before. They were formed in the Ozarks in Taney County in the 1880s. Around 1884 to 1889 was the era when they were terrorizing the area. Though they did form for a good reason, but as good intentions go, things don't always work out the way you intend. I'm going to be driving all around Taney County today, and I'm going to be looking at where they formed the group, where murders occurred that encouraged them to want to form the group, things like that. And then in a subsequent episode, this should take two, we'll be talking about the downfall of the Baldknobbers. That will mostly be in Christian County. But today, let's get started. This is the Forsyth Cemetery in Forsyth, Missouri. This is known also as the Baldknobber Cemetery. The name Groom. There was a Baldknobber named Groom. I'm assuming he's probably one of these. But we're here to find Nat Kinney. Nat Kinney moved to Taney County in 1883. Oh, here he is. Here's his wife, Maggie. This is the grave of Nat Kinney. Nat Kinney was one of the founding members of the Baldknobbers, and through their reign, he was pretty much the leader of the group in Taney County. He served in the Civil War for the Union in the 6th West Virginia Volunteer Infantry. He was a private through the whole war, although later he did claim to be a captain, but he never was. But, you know, before he moved here, he did a lot of different things. He was a member of lots of fraternal organizations. He was a member of the GAR. He was a member of the Grange. He had worked in a saloon in Springfield, there on the square, run by another man named Kinney, who was of no relation. He moved to Taney County in 1883, where he had a farm. His farm was a couple miles outside of Kirbyville, near the Snaps Balds, which is 4 mountains. Because he lived near the area, he chose the mountain they would meet on. He was a huge man. He was well over 6 feet tall. People say anywhere from 6'2" to 6'7". For the day, he was a giant. A lot of the Baldknobbers were not locals. They were transplants, just like Kinney. They had put their heart and soul into living here, and they came to a place with all of this violence after the Civil War. They didn't want to give up what they were building here because of the lawlessness. Of all the Baldknobbers, though, he is the only one who was a very staunch Democrat. And he was always trying to run for office. He ran for state rep 2 or 3 times and always lost to the Republican candidate. Because of his high rank in the Baldknobbers, that's a little unusual. It makes you wonder, was it just because he was a Democrat, or was there something about his personality that they didn't think he needed to have public office? Over the course of this series, we're going to see a lot of things having to do with Nat Kinney and his life. We're going to see where he taught Sunday school and went to church. We're going to see the knob where they had their meetings. We're going to see where he died in 1888. He was murdered. We're going to be talking about a lot of murder in this series, actually. And at least one lynching. I am at the former site of Forsyth, Missouri. They had to move the town because it was constantly flooding. And you can see here how close it is to the river. But this park used to be the square of Forsyth. And this is where a lot of this Baldknobber activity occurred. The murder that set off the formation of the Baldknobbers happened right here on the town square. It happened in the Everett Saloon. It was run by James Everett, and his brother Barton. Now, everybody called Barton Yell because he talked louder than he needed to all the time. And their store was somewhere in this general vicinity, kind of around this pavilion. It was at the corner of the square, and it was fairly near the jail, which is right there. And then the courthouse sat somewhere over that direction toward that road. It was called the Everett Saloon. There was a billiard table in the back. The bar was in the front. They sold a whiskey that was so strong, it was called 40 Rod. On the night of September 22nd, 1883, maybe the two gentlemen who came in that day were drunk on that. Their names were Al Layton and Sam Hull, and they were playing billiards in the back when they got into a fight. James Everett came, he broke it up, and he tossed Al Layton out into the street, told him to get out, stay out. Layton wouldn't stay down, and he wouldn't calm down, and eventually James Everett had to get on him and hold him down, and they were trying to make him calm down, and he wouldn't do it. After a while, a bystander suggested maybe James should just let him stand up, which sadly he did. Al Layton stood up, brushed himself off, pulled out his gun, and shot James Everett in the chest twice. He then turned and shot Barton, got on his horse, and fled. Layton was a member of a very prominent family in Forsyth. His cousin was actually the city clerk. His name was Thomas Layton. The sheriff was friends with his family. There was not a whole lot of hope going into this, even though Al Layton did eventually turn himself in to the sheriff, John Mosley. People were not convinced that justice would be done in this case, because it hardly ever was. Even when people got arrested for murders, they more often than not got away with it. Layton had his trial, and as everyone feared, he was acquitted. People were enraged. I guess the Baldknobbers, or who eventually became the Baldknobbers, anticipated this because they may have met in Everett's saloon to have a meeting about forming a vigilance committee before the verdict was read. No one really knows exactly when the meeting happened. 13 of them met in Everett's store, including Nathaniel Kinney was there, Alonzo Prather, Barton Everett, who was shot, James Rice, Thomas Phillips, James Van Zant, Patterson Fickle, J.J. Brown, Galba Branson, James K. Polk McAfee, James A. DeLong, Charles Groom, and Benjamin Price. Kinney was chair of the meeting, and Nat Kinney would continue to be the major leadership force in this group. And they drew up a resolution to form a vigilance committee, and they came up with an oath that every member would take. Taney County was overwhelmingly represented by Democrats in power, ex-Confederates. Most of the guys who joined the Baldknobbers were Republicans. Most of them had fought for the Union. A month after his acquittal, there was an election, and the Democrats in power were absolutely annihilated by the Republicans. The prosecutor lost his job. The sheriff lost his job. He was friends with the Layton family. The county clerk was a cousin of Al Layton. His name was Thomas Layton. He is actually the only one who kept his position because his term wasn't up. Other than that, Republicans wiped out every position. Whether there were any shenanigans regarding this, I don't know. A lot of the reasons juries sometimes let people go in these situations and acquitted is because they were neighbors with these people's families. This is not a huge community. They may have feared backlash from family members of these powerful families like the Laytons if they convicted them. These four mountains are known as Snap's Balds. They are no longer bald. In 1884, they were, because of the timber industry. The mountains had been stripped of their timber, which meant by meeting on top of one of these mountains, they could see if anyone was coming. During this meeting on April 5th, 1884, the first time the Baldknobbers met, officially, about 100 men attended the meeting. Nat Kinney gave a stirring speech, basically waving the bloody shirt of James Everett, not literally, but metaphorically. Are we going to stand back? Are we going to let law and order be trampled like this? Or are we going to stand up for our rights and our people and our families and make sure that law and order are kept? Nat Kinney was voted their chieftain at this meeting. Everyone who was going to be a member took the oath. Nat Kinney set a rule that they would not write anything down. No paper records of any kind would be kept, so that the organization would remain secret. The group was organized somewhat like the military in that there were leaders of companies. They called them legions, but they were smaller companies with one leader. I'm not sure how many people were in each. James DeLong's group, which was Nat Kinney's stepson, there were up to 40 men in his, but I don't know if they all were that big. You may have figured out that they were called the Baldknobbers because they met on these bald knobs, on these bald mountains, essentially. In Taney County, they did not wear masks. There was no reason to. They didn't care if people knew who they were. After that 1884 election, they were in charge of everything. A Baldknobber was the sheriff. They had control of the government, the city government. They had no worries about people knowing who they were. The first public act that the Baldknobbers did happened 2 days after their first meeting. On April 7th, 1885, they surrounded the jail. Sitting in that jail was a man named Newton Harrell. He'd been in there for 7 months and he was awaiting trial for the murder of Amos Ring. Amos Ring had been living with his mother. They weren't married. She was a widow, but they were a couple. They were living together in sin, and he took offense to what this relationship did to his mother's reputation. He came to talk to Mr. Ring, express his unhappiness with the situation, and Mr. Ring decided he was going to teach the boy a lesson. He pulled a log out of the stove, I don't know whether it was on fire or not, and ran at Newton Harrell, who pulled out his gun and shot him. It was late in the night. 60 to 100 men surrounded the jail. They demanded that Sheriff McAfee give them Harrell, I guess, to lynch. McAfee refused to give up the keys to the jail, and ultimately they did back down that night. McAfee was a founding member of the Baldknobbers, so it's unknown if they just wanted to scare Harrell or if there was a fundamental disagreement within the group about how they were going to operate and whether or not they were going to pull people from the jails and lynch them. Maybe it was just showing the community this is what we're willing to do. The Baldknobbers did go that night into the judge's chambers, though, and leave a noose on his desk as a message, you better convict this guy. To protect him, Harrell was moved to Springfield. He eventually escaped from there and was free for 2 years before he was finally captured in Golden City, Missouri in 1887. That very same day, Frank Taylor went into the Dickinson store in Ellington. The store was owned by John T. Dickinson, and Frank was going there to buy a pair of boots. He wanted Mr. Dickinson to put it on his credit. Dickinson refused to do this because the credit Frank already had, he hadn't paid. This made Frank very angry. He proceeded to yell at Dickinson, curse at him, threaten him, and then he tore up the store, knocking merchandise off the shelves, just wrecking the store. In the past, Mr. Dickinson probably would have let this go, but he was a member of the Baldknobbers now. So he went into town and he turned him in and he put out an indictment on Frank, which a grand jury agreed, and Frank was charged with disturbing the peace. Frank had a brother named Tubal. They were known as the Taylor Gang, and they had terrorized Forsyth for years. They would maim people's cattle. Things like cutting their tongues out and leaving them to starve to death. Other people's cattle, just unbelievable cruelty to animals and to the property of other people. They were thieves. They would ride through town, firing their guns in the air. Occasionally, they would come into town and they would say, drinks are all on us. We don't make our money honestly anyway. 2 days after Mr. Dickinson got him charged with a crime, Frank went back to the store. He was enraged. He confronted Mr. Dickinson. He had a long whip with him, presumably to flog Mr. Dickinson with. He calmly sat down next to Mr. Dickinson in the store and said, good evening, before grabbing him by the throat. They were struggling with each other. Dickinson was trying to free himself. Frank took his gun and fired it into Mr. Dickinson's face. His mouth, actually. It knocked out several of his teeth and part of his jaw. Mrs. Dickinson heard the commotion. She came down to help her husband. There was more struggling. The gun fired 4 more times, hitting Mr. Dickinson in the shoulder and lightly wounding Mrs. Dickinson as well. This led to a huge manhunt. Frank thought that he had killed them. His brother Tubal was with him and they were fleeing. Tubal was wanted for animal cruelty. When the brothers learned that Mr. Dickinson and his wife had not died, they decided to turn themselves in, probably believing, like Al Layton, they would just be let go, because that's what always seemed to happen. They turned themselves in to Sheriff McAfee on April 15th, 1885. They were placed in the jail, and that evening, around 10 p.m., anywhere from 75 to 100 armed men surrounded the jail, just like they had with Newton Harrell. But this time, Sheriff McAfee didn't stop them. They used sledgehammers to pound down the doors, break into the jail, and they drug the brothers outside, who now realize they're in big trouble. The Baldknobbers brought the brothers here in what is now the Methodist Church parking lot. I don't know the exact spot where the tree stood. It is gone, but it was somewhere in this vicinity. The next morning, the two brothers were found hanging from an oak tree. On the back of Tubal Taylor's shirt, they had placed a sign that read, "Beware. These are the first victims to the wrath of outraged citizens. More will follow. The Baldknobbers." The only person who was definitively identified in this huge crowd of people with no masks on was Nat Kinney, and that is because he was such a big man, you couldn't miss him. But I also think there was probably a little bit of people just didn't report the names of the people they saw. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you have enjoyed our discussion of the rise of the Baldknobbers. Please join me next time as we talk about the reign of the Baldknobbers.